Hi everyone, this is a Barclay Damon live broadcast where we discuss all things L&E, labor, and employment. I'm Ari, let's dig in. Hi everyone, welcome to What's Up with COVID-19 Vaccination Mandates Part 3. In this episode, we are continuing our discussion of OSHA's ETS mandate, which, as our listeners know, if you listened to last week's episode, basically is a mandate which requires employers with 100 or more employees to adopt a mandatory vaccination policy or a test-out requirement. As we mentioned last week, the mandate is currently stayed, but it is important that if you are an employer and you have over 100 employees, you know what's going on with this because it's really hard to predict, how this will all shake out. I am thrilled again to announce we have Mike Sciotti joining us this week. Mike and I talked, about a lot of the requirements in the mandate last week, and we're just going to pick back up right where we left off. Hey, Mike.
Hello again.
Thanks for joining us.
No problem.
So, Mike, when we ended last week's episode, we got into the contents of the mandatory vaccination policy and also the record keeping requirements for employers. What I wanted to start with today was to ask you, must an employer who has implemented a mandatory vaccination policy verify that its employees are in fact vaccinated?
Yeah, the answer is yes. You're going to have to basically come up with a manner in which to determine the vaccination status of your workforce. So, typically what we're seeing are employers asking a series of questions to their employees and requiring them to upload their vaccination card. So let's be like question one. Let's say it was the Pfizer. Question one, what vaccine? Pfizer, Moderna, or Johnson & Johnson? You picked Pfizer. Date of first shot, date of second shot. And now we're starting to see the booster question. When did you get the booster? Yes. And you upload a copy of your card. That would be an acceptable proof of vaccination in that regard. Just remember what I said, though, I think last week. The ETS does not cover the booster. I think it's something that you as an employer want to know, especially if to determine accommodations. I think it's prudent to know what part of your workforce is vaccinated and what part is not at the end of the day. We're also seeing some geniuses out there who's lost their card. And I'm like, really? There is an attestation form available. There is another way through a healthcare provider giving the information. But the best proof, the easiest proof, seems to be uploading and producing a copy of the card themselves. Just make sure, if you remember from last week, I said if you have a policy, within your policy, you have to give an employee a warning. If you give us a fake card, it's a felony.
Right.
And it's real serious. We're seeing people prosecuted. I did do a search last week on Google about purchasing a fake vaccine card. I actually came across some sites that you were able to do it. So these sites are out there, and your employees are going to try to scam you. And just funny story, Ari, I don't know if you saw this. An employee got busted the other day. He had a fake arm, and he went to get the vaccine, and he had a fake arm. So he was trying to get pretend to get the vaccine, but using a fake arm, and he got busted. I mean, it's just amazing what we're starting to see.
I did not see that, Mike.
Yeah, that was pretty funny. And the other thing here in New York is the Excelsior Pass, where they download
Yes.
a copy of an app, and then they ask you a series of questions, and it's tied into the state's records, and you get this pass that shows you're good. And I think that would qualify as well.
Yeah, I think that's a good point too. And I was going to ask you about the Excelsior Pass. I know myself, our listeners know I'm in the Buffalo office. I actually was in New York City last weekend, and, I had to show proof of vaccination. I used the Excelsior Pass, pretty much anywhere I went. And last night I actually went to see Hamilton at Shays in Buffalo and also had to show proof of vaccination through the Excelsior Pass. So it's definitely an easy way that you can, show proof of vaccination.
Yeah, and I think what's happened between last week and this week is also that New York State implemented you either have to check
Yes.
the vaccination status of everyone coming into your workplace, and they have to be fully vaxxed, or you basically have to mask up everyone, even if they're fully vaxxed, in indoor parts of your facility, with a few exceptions. I went to a bank yesterday, and the bank had a security guard there. Show me your proof of vaccination, or
Yep.
you're not coming in. And
Yep.
so it's reality. It's here.
Yep, and actually, to our listeners, tune in because next week we are going to talk about the new mandate that went into effect in New York State as it relates to the indoor mask mandate. So, stay tuned. So, Mike, just getting back to, I think we talked about proof of vaccination and what qualifies as proof. And, I think you mentioned, if you lost your vaccination card or if you can't provide proof, um, there is an attestation form, I think you mentioned, correct?
Correct.
Does that attestation form have to have any type of physician or medical provider signature on it?
No, it includes the following: the employee signing an attestation that they're fully vaxxed. Which dose did you take? When did you take them? Who administered them? That you've lost your card and you can't find it. And then there's a criminal warning that during basically the employees saying, I swear to this under penalties of perjury, and I realize I can get arrested if I'm lying. That is the sum and substance of it. It's enough to verify, if you needed to, the underlying truth of it, especially if OSHA did an audit. OSHA could go back to the healthcare provider, arguably, and see if this is true or not, and probably cross-reference with the state. But the healthcare provider does not have to sign it. There is a separate one with the production of medical records from the healthcare provider that would be sufficient as well.
Understood. And that leads me to my next point, Mike, which is, if you're an employer and you have this policy, you have to, you know, have proof of the employee's vaccination status. And I think you have to have a roster of each employee and their vaccination status. And like any other medical record, you would keep that proof of vaccination separate from the employee's personnel file. Is that right?
That's correct. All this would be subject to what I call the medical record confidentiality requirements of the ADA, GINA, the human rights law, which
Yep.
basically says the medical stuff is not placed in the personnel file, but is kept separate and apart in the medical file.
Right. Exactly. So, just the last point on the mandatory vaccination piece, and then I want to transition to talking about the test out, piece of the ETS mandate. But I think that the regulations have some specific ways that employers must support, what the regulations deem support, COVID-19 vaccination for employees. Is that right?
That's correct. Two main things. You got to go let them get the vaccine during work hours if that's when they get it, and you're going to have to pay them up to 4 hours in that regard, sort of consistent with the New York State
Yep.
vaccine leave law in that regard. And then you got to give them time to recover if they have a reaction in that regard. And like here in New York, there was already a directive from the Department of Labor. Paid sick leave it should be used in the first instance
Yep.
for the recovery of it. The OSHA standard adds one interesting thing, though. You cannot force someone to go into the negative on their paid sick leave
Yes.
in that regard. So I interpreted that it would be leave without pay, and you can't go let their account go into the negative.
Yes.
So that those are the two very general things that it requires. Again, I don't think either one is a shocker to people or a big deal. Some of it, and the other thing I'd add, Ari, is if the employee schedules the vaccine during non-working hours, you do not have to pay that up to the 4 hours because they did it on their own time. But you do have to allow them time off to recover if they have an adverse reaction. Everyone is different. For me, shot 1 did nothing. Shot 2, I slept a lot, and the booster, I slept like 14 hours. So, but that everyone is different. I mean,
Right.
other people, there's nothing, and some people will be back to work immediately. I've known people 5 days they were affected by Pfizer 2 or Moderna 2. I think it just depends on the person and how they react.
Absolutely. And it's so interesting, I think, with everything with the pandemic, that's obviously been such a theme that it seems like everybody reacts differently to, pretty much everything surrounding the virus. So presents some additional challenges, I would say.
Yeah, and one of the biggest challenges I see for employers is keeping up with all this stuff.
Yep.
I mean, I have yet to meet someone who fully gets every aspect of this, because it seems like every day there's something we're getting hit with,
Yes.
whether it's like, I mean, a couple weeks ago was the New York City mandate.
Yes.
Then we have the face covering mandate.
Yep.
It's constant. So the employers don't feel bad if you can't keep up. None of us can.
I know. So I think it's a lot to keep track of. I think it definitely keeps our jobs very interesting. But I was saying to my husband last night, I kind of miss the days where you didn't have like a new law you had to keep track of basically every week.
Yeah.
Depending on where you are too, and then kind of you throw the New York City stuff in there, and it's just in New York, it's a whole different ballgame. But Mike, that's great. I think we went through everything I wanted to talk about as it related to the vaccination policy piece of it. Before we talk testing or the test out piece, anything else you want to add on the vaccination piece?
No, I would just say you need to monitor this and see where it goes with OSHA and ultimately the U.S. Supreme Court issuing a ruling. Um, and that's the difficult part. I think that if the standard is upheld, the dates will be reset by OSHA.
Yes.
But otherwise, I think it's what we've discussed is the thrust of it. Knowing, there are more details in it, but I think you're sort of getting the thrust of it by this podcast.
Right. There are more details, and also stay tuned because, kind of up in the air.
Yep.
So, Mike, let's talk testing. So, I know we talked last week briefly about the test out piece of the ETS mandate, but can you just tell our listeners, what does that piece of the mandate say?
Sure. If you're going to allow a test out, who administers the test? I mean, it can either be most people are you going to a third party. They'll go to a hospital and get tested. They'll go to their physician and get tested. They'll go to an urgent care like a Well Now and get tested, and then they'll come back with a result a day or so later. All those are acceptable. We also see this these home administered tests, if you can find them. That call like $25 a shot, and if an employee wants to use one of those, they can, but they cannot both self-administer and self-read the test. So you either have to get the employer involved or a telehealth provider to assist with it. For that reason, I'm telling employers to shy away from that and basically tell them, hey, go. I don't want to get involved in reading your test result or administering the test. Go to a Well Now or something like that, and go over there and do it.
Right. So, Mike, for the testing out piece of it, I wanted to ask, does this apply again to all employees, or these are, if you work remotely exclusively, are you subject to the testing requirement?
Yeah. The workers who are exclusively remotely, they don't come in the office at all. None of the testing requirements and the vaccination requirements do not apply to them. Where it comes up, Ari, is if, let's say you got 50 employees working remotely, one of them is asked to come into a meeting
Yep.
in the office, and they want the person in there. They don't want to do it by Zoom
Mhm.
or teens or something else, the employee must provide a test result if they are not fully vaccinated, and you need that 7-day lead-in in order to do it. So you're going to have to plan it out a little bit to make sure that the employee has sufficient time to test and come on in. That there'd be no testing issue if the employee was fully vaccinated.
Right.
They could come on in immediately if they were fully vaxxed. So it depends on the employee, and that's why I think um, even for the ones working exclusively at home, I think you must track the vaccination status of those individuals, have them upload the proof, so you have it,
Right.
because it's going to be very important. And some employers are complaining, they expect me to keep track of all this. My response is yes, OSHA does,
Yes.
and the discussion, you have to do it.
So the testing requirement applies to non-vaccinated workers who report to work at least once every 7 days. That's right.
Correct.
Okay. Now, and that was important, I think, and smart of you to point out, Mike, that, if you do have an unvaccinated worker who predominantly works remotely, it's not a situation under this mandate where you can say, okay, unvaccinated employee, we need you in the office in 3 hours for a meeting.
Yeah, can't
Because you
happen.
have to have the proof of a negative test before that individual can come into the office.
Correct. And so some of this will create a burden to an employer if it's an emergency situation. But, I think don't overthink it, employers. I mean, some of it is as simple as uh, hopefully you can plan things out. Hopefully you really don't need the employee. You do a Zoom.
Yep.
But if you really do need the employee, there's not really an exception unless they're fully vaxxed to come in right away. So just beware in that regard.
Yes. So let's talk a little bit, Mike, about, the proof of a negative test. What qualifies as proof of a negative test under the ETS mandate?
Sure. So, like I indicated, you went to the hospital, you went to Well Now, and they give you a little piece of paper that I've gotten like 10 COVID tests negative, COVID-19 SARS not present. That is something that will clearly qualify in that regard. Also, remember what I said about self-administered tests,
Yep.
and if the test was done properly in accordance with that the manufacturer's directions, and the employer reads it, and it shows negative, that's going to be acceptable as well. What you can't have is an employee self-administering and self-reading their own test result. That would not be acceptable at the end of the day.
Right. So, Mike, this test out portion of the mandate, basically it says unvaccinated workers must, be tested regularly, once every 7 days. And in addition, if an unvaccinated employee is in the workplace, the unvaccinated employee must wear a face covering. Correct?
That is correct, and they go into some ad nauseum detail as
Yes.
to what is an acceptable
Yes.
mask/covering.
Right. Yes. So, so basically, this is really twofold. It's testing and mask wearing for unvaccinated employees.
That is correct, and the employer, you have an obligation to make sure that they're wearing a proper mask, that the mask is fitted properly. They're not wearing it down here, which you go through the Dunkin' Donut lines, and all the workers have their mask down here.
Yes.
If it's wet or soiled, they can you got to tell them to replace it. Some other rules they put in place was, if the employee wants to wear a respirator to work,
Yes.
the full, you can't stop them. They're entitled to. You don't have to provide it, but if they want to go overboard and wear basically a gas mask, they're entitled to. At the end of the day, I don't know how it's going to work with workplace communication, but
True.
you can't prevent it. The employee can also wear a face shield over the covering, and you as an employer can't stop it in that regard. The only thing I would say is You can't stop it. I use it very generally. If there is some safety issue created by the mask,
Yes.
I think you're always allowed to intervene in that regard. But it's so business specific, and I haven't come across a specific scenario yet where that was an issue. Like sometimes you look at it this way: it's like if the mask is creates a hazard. So like if I'm wearing jewelry and a long necklace and I'm working around machines that go like this,
Yes.
I'm well within my rights as an employer to take that jewelry off because you could hurt yourself or even kill yourself or others in that regard.
Sure. So, Mike, but the ETS mandate does provide for certain exceptions to this to the face covering requirement. For example, if an employee's alone in a room, with floor to ceiling walls and a closed door, then the employee, while in that space, does not have to wear the mask.
Yeah, and it's sort of what we're dealing with right now here in New York.
Yes.
There's a common area rule like the elevator, the reception area, the hallways. You mask up. But if you're in your own office with the door closed, and not a cubicle,
Yes.
it's a
Yes,
confined
important
four
distinction.
sides. You're allowed to take it off in that regard. There's an exception for eating lunch as well. So yes, there exists, but they're very limited in scope.
So, Mike, a question that's kind of twofold. Under the mandate, does an employer have to pay for one, testing, and two, face coverings?
No, is the general rule. But what we are seeing more often than not is if the employer is mandating the test, sometimes they're holding testing clinics right at their facility, and they'll pay for it. We're seeing employees more and more. The employee forgets their face mask. They have one available to them in that regard. But generally speaking, the directive, the ETS standard says no. Then there's the practical reality of what's going on in the workplace, and many employers are doing this. Many aren't, but many are.
I think that makes sense. I guess depending on the size and your workforce and whether your workforce does report to work predominantly, or I guess it's a very particular, individualized decision.
Yeah. And then the other thing I would simply say is you need to analyze if the OSHA standard goes into effect. You always have to remember the state law and the local law.
Yes.
If it provides a greater duty on you as an employer, if it's not inconsistent with the OSHA standard, you're going to have to follow that as well.
Exactly. So, Mike, I know we talked about this in the context of the mandatory vaccination policy, but I did want to touch briefly on, an OSHA-related inquiry, about these testing requirements. So I think the regulations basically have some certain requirements, if an employee makes a request as it relates to the testing, how an employer must respond and what the time frame is, if you could talk about that.
Sure. OSHA has always allowed employees to make requests of their employer regarding certain medical issues. So, for example, an employee can always ask for a copy of their medical file,
Yes.
And the employer has to give them a copy of it or let them look at it and make copies, whatever the case may be. Consistent with that standard, what OSHA has done here is basically said, if an employee asks, I want a copy of my vaccine card, I lost it, well, give it to them. Give them a copy of it. The other thing the employee has the right to ask for is what is the vaccination status of the workforce?
Yes.
Meaning not by name. You don't give out the name Johnny Jones is vaccinated, Tina Smith is not.
Right.
What you do is what are the numbers? It's basically a number game. How many are fully vaccinated? How many have the first dose? If you want, throw in the information about the booster, but it's really a number. And my recollection is you have one business day to respond to that request. The same request can be made by OSHA, and you have 4 business hours to respond, consistent with the request for your policy. It's a very quick turnaround time. So we analyze the request. Sometimes employees ask more than they're entitled to, but we have to give them the minimum, the information we're entitled to. But that's also a great point, because you have to track this. And the other reason, even if the OSHA standard doesn't go into effect, let's say the Supreme Court ultimately says, OSHA, you're crazy, you didn't have the authority to do this. Whether they do or don't, I don't know. But let's say that's the ultimate ruling here. Should I still keep track of the vaccination status of my employees? Absolutely. The EEOC has indicated that the number of employees who are fully vaxxed or partially vaxxed, have one of the 2 shots in the series, is a factor to consider relative to reasonable accommodations and undue hardships in the workplace. So I've taken the position consistently since the vaccine rolled out. You need to track how many people are fully vaxxed, partially vaxxed, or refuse to get it at all, and now I throw in the booster.
Yep.
Because I think you need to for purposes of accommodation requests.
Yes, I think that's great sage advice, Mike, as it relates to tracking, what's happening with your workforce, regardless of the status of the ETS mandate. So I think the last thing, Mike, I want to chat about, and don't hold me to that, is, I think the ETS, the regs or the regulations basically say that employers, make a good faith effort to implement these types of policies. What can you tell us what the regs say about this good faith effort?
Yeah, it comes down to enforcement. OSHA has a hammer. They can fine you as an employer. And what they basically said is, look, in the first instance, we know this is new. We're going to take a look at your good faith efforts. Do you have a policy in place? Did you distribute your policy? Do you follow your policy? Do you track the number who's vaccinated, who's not vaccinated? They're going to give some leeway. Some workforces are very fluid. There's a lot of turnover that occurs within workforces, and so the vaccination status sometimes gets lost in the mix. And if you have, I think their number was 95% or 90% compliance, they're going to sort of cut you a break on the other few percent that you're off on. But even if the ETS standard goes into effect, that's only going to be initially. At some point, they'll go from education to taking out the hammer and coming down hard on you. What the amount of this grace period is going to be, I don't know, but the good news is we'll have some new deadlines if the standard is approved by the courts, and if it's not approved by the courts, we won't care. That'll be the end of it, unless they want to try again. In that regard. But the other thing I think, you're going to see, forget OSHA for a minute, what New York City did and what the mayor did down there to private sector employers. I think you're going to see states and, more importantly, localities issuing these local laws on mandates. And wow, that's going to be a whole nother level for us to take a look through. But it's going to happen. It's happening now with New York City.
Very true. Well, Mike, thank you so much for joining us again this week. I think that's everything I wanted to run through as it relates to the whole universe of the requirements for employers under the ETS mandate. I really appreciate your time. Anything to add as we wrap up today?
No, I thank you for having me. I would simply say, don't feel bad if you can't keep up, because it's a day-to-day grind in this issue, in this area, and it's difficult for every single employer, period.
Absolutely, Mike. And to our listeners, stay tuned. Next week, we're going to talk about, what your obligations are or your rights as an employer are if you do not fall under the CMS mandate or the OSHA mandate. So thanks so much for tuning in. See you next week. The Labor Employment Podcast is available on barclaydamon.com, YouTube, LinkedIn, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. Like, follow, share, and continue to listen. Thanks. This material is for informational purposes only and does not constitute legal advice or a legal opinion, and no attorney-client relationship has been established or implied. Thanks for listening.